Marcus Chen built his empire on cold calculation and an almost inhuman ability to see through people. Billions flowed through his hands like water through a sieve. Each acquisition a puzzle solved, each negotiation a battle won, before the other side realized they were losing. He had everything: penthouses overlooking Central Park, Shanghai and Dubai, a private jet that waited on tarmac like a loyal dog, board seats at Fortune 500 companies, a Rolex collection that represented decades of millionaire milestones. Yet walking through his minimalist Manhattan apartment at midnight, listening to the hum of the air conditioning and the distant growl of traffic 47 stories below, he felt the weight of his own emptiness pressing against his ribs like a stone in his chest. He'd never had a friend who wasn't on his payroll. He'd never had a conversation that wasn't transactional. He'd never felt truly known. Then he met Amara in a village market in Zambia, where he'd gone to close a mining deal that would displace 3,000 farming families. She was barefoot, her feet cracked from the red dust, selling woven baskets under a corrugated tin roof. Her dress faded, but her smile luminous. The kind of smile that suggested she'd chosen joy despite evidence against it. She didn't know who he was. She didn't care. When he sat with her over tea made from boiled water and wild herbs, listening, truly listening, for perhaps the first time in his adult life, to her dreams of opening a small school for children who couldn't afford one, something fractured inside him so profoundly he heard it like breaking glass. For the first time in decades, Marcus felt seen by another human being, not for his net worth, not for his power, just seen. He married her within 6 months, whisking her away to New York in his private jet, convinced he was rescuing her from poverty and hardship. She followed gently, never correcting his assumptions, never telling him the truth that lived in the silence between her words. But secrets have a weight that grows heavier with time, and gravity always wins. When Amara's true identity was revealed, it would force Marcus to ask the question he'd spent his whole life avoiding. What is a man worth if he has everything except a heart? Chapter 1. The Billionaire's Loneliness. That day began like any other, until one act of kindness changed everything. Marcus stood at the floor-to-ceiling window of his office on the 47th floor of a Manhattan tower that bore his family name. Watching the rain blur the city into watercolor impressionism, his reflection stared back, impeccably tailored Tom Ford suit, titanium cufflinks that caught the light, the mask of a man who'd won every game he'd played since childhood. Below, millions of people rushed through their lives with purpose, with urgency, with the illusion of meaning. He couldn't remember the last time he'd rushed anywhere. Rushing implied desire. Desire implied vulnerability. Vulnerability implied the possibility of loss. His assistant, the third one in 2 years, knocked with the hesitant precision of someone who'd learned that entering his office uninvited could result in termination. "The Lagos investors are waiting, Mr. Chen." He nodded without turning from the window. In his mind, he was already 3 moves ahead of them. He'd studied their financial statements at 5 a.m. He knew their desperation. They needed capital more than they needed dignity, which meant he could acquire their mining concession for 15% below market value. He'd learned long ago that every person had a price. Most people's price was just money. A few required ego. Fewer still wanted legacy. The meeting occurred in the mahogany-paneled conference room on the 48th floor. It was deliberately designed to intimidate. The table was so long that conversations across it required small speakers. The leather chairs were positioned at varying heights so that Marcus always sat slightly higher. The art on the walls were pieces so valuable they were essentially hostages. By the end of 90 minutes, the Lagos delegation had agreed to terms that would make them wealthy, but Marcus wealthier. One man's hands trembled as he signed the contract. Marcus noticed this the way a shark notices blood in water, as information, not as anything requiring empathy. By evening, Marcus had acquired mining rights worth 200 million. By evening, he'd forgotten the names of everyone involved. That night, he sat alone in his apartment, the penthouse that occupied the entire 60th floor of a building he owned, with a glass of 30-year-old Macallan whiskey. The leather sofa cost more than most people's annual salary. The art on his walls had been appraised for 7 figures by auction houses that trembled at his bids. The view commanded the entire Manhattan skyline like a monarch surveys their kingdom. Yet the silence pressed against his ears like deep water, and he was drowning in air. He'd had lovers, sophisticated women from old money and new money, women who understood the rules of transactional romance. But he'd never had love. Love required vulnerability. Love required the admission that you needed someone. Marcus had trained himself since childhood not to need anyone. His parents, distant figures who communicated through lawyers and assistants, had died in a car accident when he was 22, leaving him their real estate empire and nothing else worth having. Their funeral had been attended by 500 people he didn't know. The reading of the will had taken 6 hours. In the aftermath, he'd learned that money was a substitute for love that worked until it didn't. He'd spent 30 years building a fortress around himself, brick by brick, acquisition by acquisition, until loneliness became so familiar he'd stopped recognizing it as a wound. It had simply become his climate. He adapted like anyone adapts to weather, by barely noticing until the storm arrived. Marcus poured another drink, feeling the burn of it, almost welcoming the sensation because at least he could feel something. He opened his laptop and reviewed the quarterly earnings reports. Numbers scrolled across the screen like digital rain. Somewhere in those numbers was meaning, he told himself. Somewhere was justification. Then his phone rang. It was James, his CEO. "Marcus, the Zambia Mineral Survey is scheduled for next week. Do you still want to go personally?" Marcus hadn't thought about it in days. The Zambia deal was routine. Acquire mining rights, develop extraction infrastructure, sell mineral wealth to the highest bidder. The fact that this would displace 3,000 farming families was classified as an externality, something to be managed by a middle manager with a clipboard and a budget for relocation compensation. But something made him say yes. Perhaps it was the whiskey, perhaps it was the depth of the silence in his apartment, which seemed to grow heavier each year. Perhaps it was the first real impulse he'd felt in months that wasn't driven by profit. "I'll go myself," he said. "Arrange it." The decision would change everything, though he couldn't have known it then. Change rarely announces itself. It arrives quietly, like a thief, and only later do you realize what it's stolen from you: your certainty, your armor, your comfortable numbness. Chapter 2. Two worlds colliding. Amara had never owned much, and so she'd learned to make abundance from nothing, that most advanced form of alchemy that poverty teaches if you survive it long enough. Her woven baskets took 3 to 5 days each to create. She'd learned the technique from her grandmother, before her grandmother died, before her mother disappeared into wealth and silence. Her hands moved with muscle memory that predated her conscious awareness, fingers threading, turning, looping, tightening. Each basket sold for 45,000 Zambian kwacha, approximately $8 American. This was enough for her mother's malaria medication, enough to rent the corrugated shelter she shared with 2 other women, enough to buy maize flour and salt. It was not enough to dream, but Amara had learned to dream anyway. She'd taught herself English from a discarded schoolbook she'd found in a missionary trash heap 4 years ago. English for Secondary Students, 1987. The pages were water-stained and missing the cover, but the lessons remained intact. She'd studied by candlelight after her market shifts ended, sounding out words, repeating them, until the correct pronunciation lived in her mouth like a second language. The village women thought her mad. "Learning English won't make you less poor," they said. "It will only make you lonely." But Amara had discovered something crucial. The ability to communicate across linguistic boundaries was the ability to communicate across class boundaries. Educated people respected education, even in its self-taught, candle-lit forms. Educated people listened. She'd also learned to calculate prices, exchange rates, profit margins, not from school, but from the necessity of survival. She could estimate the weight of grain from sight alone. She could negotiate with merchants who wanted to cheat her, gently but firmly, by speaking their language and meeting their eyes. She could smile at tourists without losing herself in the smile. The village knew her as quiet, capable, touched by something that suggested blessing rather than curse. Customers lingered at her stall longer than the baskets merited, as if her presence was itself a product they were purchasing. When the tall black man in the Italian suit arrived at her market stall, Amara felt him before she saw him. There was a quality to his approach, the heaviness of someone carrying weight they didn't know how to put down. He moved like expensive shoes moved when worn by someone uncomfortable with comfort. "These are beautiful," he said, and his voice contained the weariness of someone who'd spoken 1,000 words that meant nothing. "Thank you," Amara replied, meeting his eyes without flinching. "You're not from here." "No. I'm from everywhere and nowhere. New York, Singapore, London. Enough money to escape any place I visit, never long enough to belong anywhere." She smiled at that observation, the kind of honesty that only emerges when someone is speaking to a stranger they'll never see again. "Then you should learn to be from somewhere. It helps. Places are like people. They only become real to you when you stop trying to own them and start trying to understand them." "Is that what you do?" he asked. "Understand this place?" "I'm learning, but I was born understanding it, and I spent years trying to escape it, so the understanding is complicated. Some days I'm sure I love this place. Some days I'm sure I hate it. Most days I'm sure I'm meant to be here." They talked for 3 hours. The sun moved across the sky like a clock hand, and other customers came and went, but Marcus stayed. He told her about his business in a way that suggested shame dressed up as achievement, acquisition this, merger that, disruption here. He told her about his loneliness disguised as success. She listened the way people listen who've learned that listening is a gift more valuable than advice. Amara told him about her dream to open a school for children who couldn't afford one. She described walking through the village at dawn and seeing children herding goats instead of reading books, their potential disappearing like morning mist. She described the weight of knowing that intelligence, real, fierce, magnificent intelligence, was being wasted because of geography and luck and the accident of birth into poverty. "I want to teach them," she said, her voice quiet but burning with conviction. "I want to show them that their poverty isn't their destiny, that education is the only form of wealth no one can take from them, that the world is larger than their village, and they have a place in that world if they want it." Marcus listened with an intensity that both attracted and frightened her. It was as if he was drowning and her words were oxygen, and he couldn't decide whether to thank her or resent her for demonstrating what he'd been missing. "What if I helped you?" he asked. "With what?" "With the school. What if I funded it?" She looked at him carefully. "Why would you do that?" "Because," he said slowly, discovering the truth as he spoke it, "I've spent my entire life building things that don't matter, and for the first time I'm looking at something that does." Chapter 3. The Courtship of Strangers. Marcus returned to the village market the next day, and the day after that. He rented a simple room in the mission house, claiming his accommodations in Lusaka were inadequate for his work schedule. The real reason was that he couldn't leave. He'd spent 30 years training himself to leave places, to exit relationships before they became too real, to keep moving, so that nothing could touch him. But Amara had touched something, and his immunity had expired. They took walks through the village at dusk, when the heat released its grip and the sky turned colors that didn't have names. He asked her questions about her childhood, and she answered with selective honesty, describing the village, the farming families, the sound of rain on tin roofs, the taste of enzima and ndiwo, the feeling of belonging to a place. She told him about her mother, who died of malaria when Amara was 16. She told him about discovering education as a way to escape, then discovering that escape wasn't the same as freedom. She didn't tell him everything. She couldn't yet. The truth about who she really was sat in her chest like a stone she was learning to carry. He told her about his parents, whom he barely remembered. He described the weight of inheritance, not the financial kind, which was relatively simple to manage, but the inheritance of emotional distance. His parents had loved him, he thought, but from a remove so great, it felt like love expressed in a foreign language he'd never fully learned to speak. On the fourth evening, he kissed her. It happened under a baobab tree, with the first stars appearing overhead like distant witnesses. She kissed him back, and in that moment she felt the weight of the deception grow heavier. But she also felt something she hadn't experienced in years, the possibility that she could be loved for who she was pretending to be, and perhaps slowly that pretense could become authentic. By the seventh day, he asked her to dinner at the small hotel where he was staying. They ate by candlelight, chicken and vegetables prepared by women who understood that flame-cooked food was flame-cooked love. He told her he'd made a decision. "The mining deal," he said quietly. "I'm canceling it." She stared at him. "You're canceling a $200 million deal?" "Yes. Because of me? Because of you. Because of what you said about potential wasted. Because I realize that I came here to take something from this place, and instead I want to give something to it. I want to fund your school. But I want more than that. I want to know you. I want to spend time with you. I want—" He paused, afraid to say it. "I want to marry you." She should have told him the truth then. She should have said, "I'm not the person you think I am. My family is wealthy beyond measure. I chose to be poor to understand what I was refusing. My father would negotiate with you for hours. My mother is famous. My education was the best money could buy." Instead, she said yes. "Comment where you're watching from. I want to see how far these stories of hope and redemption can travel." Chapter 4. The Fantasy of Rescue. The wedding happened in the village, in the church with the blue door and the cross made from salvaged metal. It was simple, 40 people, songs sung a cappella, vows spoken in English and the local language. Amara wore a white dress that Marcus's assistant had overnight from London, and she cried through the entire ceremony. Tears that meant more than joy but looked like it. Marcus felt like a man who'd finally purchased the one thing money couldn't buy, and now that he possessed it, he could rest. He could finally stop running. When they arrived in New York 3 weeks later, he began constructing a narrative around her arrival. He was rescuing her, the poor village girl, plucked from hardship and obscurity, blessed with his fortune and his name. He introduced her to his business associates as "my wife from Africa," with a pride that bordered on paternalism. He watched their eyes widen. A black billionaire, yes, but a black billionaire who'd married a woman who looked like she'd stepped out of National Geographic. It was exotic, it was noble. It suggested he'd transcended the cynicism of his usual social circle. He bought her clothes, expensive things from designers whose names required French pronunciation: Versace, Valentino, Alexander McQueen. The clothes didn't fit her spirit, though she wore them gracefully. She moved through his penthouses like a ghost visiting her own funeral, polite and present, but fundamentally absent. He took her to galas, where she smiled politely and said nothing, standing beside him like a beautiful ornament he'd acquired at auction. He set up a trust fund with her name on it, $50 million, enough to guarantee she'd never need him. He'd won her, and in winning her he'd finally done something that felt like it had moral weight. The narrative was clean. Billionaire saves village girl. Billionaire becomes human through love. Billionaire is finally complete. Amara watched him construct this story and said nothing. She'd already explored his office when he was in meetings. The cold efficiency, the photographs with politicians and celebrities arranged on walls like trophies from psychological wars. She'd stood in his penthouse and felt the emptiness screaming from the walls, from the furniture that cost more than families, from the art that hung like questions no one was asking. She'd listened to him speak about his life with the detachment of a man reading a corporate report, as if his own biography was data to be analyzed. But she also saw glimpses of the man she'd met in the market, in quiet moments, when he thought no one was watching. When he looked at her like she was the only real thing in his life, the only proof that he wasn't a ghost. In those moments, she loved him so much it frightened her, because love based on a lie is love standing on ice. At night, she'd lie awake while he slept, listening to him breathe, feeling the weight of her deception growing heavier. She'd think about her father, Chief Kwame Okonkwo, who'd taught her that power and wealth were interchangeable. She'd think about her mother, a UNESCO director who'd learned to smile and remain silent while her husband destroyed farming communities to expand his mineral empire. She'd run away from that world to discover authenticity, but in discovering it, she'd built a new lie. Chapter 5. The Crack in the Facade. 3 months into their marriage, Marcus discovered that Amara had been secretly volunteering at a community center in Harlem 3 days a week. He learned this by accident when a car service driver mentioned dropping her off repeatedly at the same address. Marcus felt a mixture of emotions: betrayal that she hadn't told him, curiosity about what she was doing, and beneath it all, a cold understanding that she'd been lying by omission. He went to the community center on a Thursday afternoon and watched her through a window. She was sitting cross-legged on a worn carpet, a group of 7 children arranged in a semicircle around her. One boy, perhaps 9 years old, was reading aloud from a picture book. He stumbled over words, his concentration furious. Amara didn't correct him harshly. She waited until he finished, then quietly asked him what he thought the story meant. When he gave a wrong answer, she didn't shame him. She asked another question that gently led him toward the right conclusion. Marcus watched this for 20 minutes, unable to move. Later, when he confronted her, he tried to sound calm. "Why are you volunteering without telling me?" "Because it matters," she said simply. "I understand that, but you could have told me. If I'd told you, you would have seen it as something you bought for me. Another acquisition. I wanted to do it because I chose to, not because you funded it. I can hire teachers. I can donate resources. Money isn't the same as presence, Marcus. I'm there. I show up. They see me. They know I believe in them. That's what changes lives, not money." He wanted to argue, but something in her eyes stopped him. He saw for the first time that she wasn't impressed by his wealth, that she valued something in herself that his fortune couldn't enhance. It was both deeply attractive and profoundly threatening. "I want to go there with you," he said quietly. She studied his face, then nodded. The following Saturday, he accompanied her. The community center was in a neighborhood that his property investments had gentrified. Buildings he'd purchased were now worth 10 times what he'd paid. He'd never actually visited these properties. They were numbers on a spreadsheet, appreciating assets. Now he walked through the door of one of them, converted into a community space, and felt something break inside him. A young girl, perhaps 7, ran up to Amara and wrapped her arms around her legs. "You came." "I always come," Amara said, kneeling to embrace her fully. "I promised." Marcus watched this exchange and understood something he'd spent 30 years avoiding. The difference between transactional relationships and genuine connection. This girl didn't care about Amara's wealth or status. She cared about presence, about showing up, about being chosen, day after day. He sat in the back while Amara taught. He watched her sit cross-legged on the floor, the same 7-year-old girl's head resting on her shoulder now, both of them pointing to words in a picture book. The girl was reading now, stumbling but present, alive with discovery. Each word was a door opening, each sentence was a window. Marcus felt tears forming and was horrified by them. Chapter 6. The Weight of Secrets. 1 month later, Amara received a phone call while Marcus was showering. She took it in the bedroom, closing the door. He didn't mean to eavesdrop, but the shower's water pressure was weak, and he came out early, and he heard fragments. "Yes, I remember. No, I've made my choice. Please tell them I'm happy. Yes, I'm certain. The school opens next month. I'm building the life I want. No, I'm not coming back." When she emerged from the bedroom, her eyes were red. Marcus was drying his hair. He turned off the blow-dryer and waited. "Who was that?" he asked carefully, though he already knew by the heaviness in her movements that this moment had been approaching. "Someone from my past," she said. "Someone important." "Are you leaving me?" The question surprised her. "No, but there's something I need to tell you, something I should have told you months ago. Something I've been carrying like a stone that gets heavier every day." His stomach tightened. He sat on the edge of the bed, preparing for infidelity, betrayal, a lie that would explain all the other lies. What he wasn't prepared for was the truth. "My name isn't just Amara," she began, sitting beside him, but not touching him. "It's Dr. Amara Okonkwo. My full name is Dr. Amara Adeyemi Okonkwo. I have a PhD in development economics from the University of Cambridge. My father is Chief Kwame Okonkwo. He owns the largest agricultural corporation in West Africa, with operations in 12 countries. My mother is Dr. Grace Okonkwo, former director of UNESCO's Africa program, and she sits on boards worth millions. I was born into privilege, Marcus, obscene, incomprehensible wealth. I had every advantage you can imagine." The words fell like stones into still water, and the ripples spread slowly outward. "But when I was 21, she continued, her voice steady, I watched my father negotiate with the Zambian government to acquire farming land that had been worked by families for generations. I watched him offer compensation that was a fraction of the land's value, a fraction of their livelihood. I watched small farmers lose their homes. I watched children stop attending school because their families had to relocate and find new work. And my father smiled, because profit is profit and displaced people are just an externality in a spreadsheet. Marcus felt his chest tighten. I watched my mother attend these negotiations and say nothing. I watched her remain silent at dinners where my father discussed these deals like they were chess moves. I watched her choose complicity over conscience, and I realized that I couldn't live that life anymore. I couldn't become her. I couldn't become him. "So you left," Marcus whispered. "I faked my own death, a boating accident off the coast of Mozambique. There was a funeral, there were tears. My parents grieved me. Then I changed my name legally and spent 5 years in that village, not because I was poor, but because I needed to understand what it meant to be human without privilege. I needed to learn if I could matter without money, if I could be loved for who I was, not for what I owned." "And what did you learn?" His voice was barely audible. "I learned that yes, I matter. I matter because I show up for people, because I listen, because I'm present. I learned that genuine connection is the only form of wealth that matters. And then I met you, and I realized you'd spent 30 years learning the opposite lesson. And I fell in love with you because you were hungry for what I'd learned. Why didn't you tell me? His voice cracked like old paint. Why did you lie to me? Because I was afraid, she said, and tears were streaming down her face now. Because I was afraid you loved the girl I was pretending to be, the poor girl you could rescue. I was afraid that if you knew my real identity, you'd want me back in that world of privilege, or worse, you'd feel betrayed. And I was right. You're feeling betrayed right now, and you're already recalculating, aren't you? Already reframing our marriage in light of new information. I need time, Marcus said. He stood and walked to the window. I need time to process this. I understand, Amara said quietly. If this story already touched your heart, hit the like button. It helps Amara's message reach more people who still believe in kindness. Chapter 7. The breaking point. Marcus did feel betrayed. He felt foolish. He'd constructed an entire narrative around saving her, around being the hero of their story, and it had been a fantasy. A lie, he'd told himself, as much as she'd told him. His money had meant nothing to her. His rescue was unnecessary. For 2 weeks they barely spoke. Communication devolved into logistics. I'm going to the office. I'll be at the community center. I'll be home late. He threw himself into work with renewed intensity, as if profit could fill the hole in his chest. He reviewed contracts with even more ruthlessness than usual. He closed a deal that would displace 400 families in Lagos with less hesitation than he'd shown before meeting Amara. He was reclaiming his numbness, trying to rebuild the fortress she'd demolished. But it wouldn't come. The numbness had been permanently compromised by exposure to her authenticity. He'd felt too much. Love had made him permeable, and you can't unpermeate yourself. One afternoon, unable to focus on spreadsheets, he went to the community center in Harlem, where she volunteered. He stood in the doorway, watching from the shadows as she taught. A boy of about 9 sat next to her, struggling with a word. He kept pronouncing it wrong, getting frustrated. Other children were distracted, fidgeting. It would have been easy to move on, to choose a child who was more responsive, more rewarding. Instead, Amara repeated the word with him, made him laugh by deliberately mispronouncing it comically, then tried again. She had infinite patience for his imperfection. She made him believe in his own capacity to learn. "You're good at this," a voice said behind him. An older woman, a supervisor, smiled at him with recognition. "She changes these kids' lives. You know that?" "I didn't," Marcus said quietly. "Or I knew it intellectually, but I didn't really know it." "You're her husband?" "I'm trying to be." "Then stop trying so hard and just be," the woman said gently. "People complicate things. Love is simple." "You love her?" "Yes." "Then that's the information that matters. Everything else is details." Chapter 8. The Reckoning and Reconstruction. That night, Marcus made a decision that required unprecedented honesty with himself. He called an emergency board meeting and announced that effective immediately, he was stepping back from daily operations. He would remain chairman, but his focus was changing fundamentally. The board members exchanged glances. This was unprecedented. Marcus Chen didn't step back from anything. He conquered. "I'm repositioning my investments," he explained calmly. "I want to divest from operations that displace communities or extract resources without genuine benefit to local populations. I want to invest in education, healthcare, and economic development in underserved regions. This will reduce short-term profits by approximately 20% over 3 years, but it aligns with my actual values, not my inherited ones." His CFO looked pale. "This is a massive shift, Marcus." "I'm aware." "What prompted this?" Marcus thought about Amara, about the girl in Harlem who'd learned to read, about the farmers in Zambia whose land he'd almost stolen. "I married my conscience," he said simply, "and she's been showing me what I look like without her." The next morning he presented Amara with a plan. She was drinking tea on the balcony, watching the city wake up below them. "I want to start a foundation," he said, sitting beside her. "A large one, using my money to support community education like yours, but scaled. I want to find young people like that boy you're teaching, and I want to give them pathways out of poverty that don't require leaving their communities. I want to fund schools, libraries, vocational training. But more importantly, I want to work beside you, not behind you. I want to learn from you. I spent 30 years building an empire I don't believe in. I want to spend the next 30 building something that matters." She set down her tea and looked at him. "You understand this means significant lifestyle changes? Less profit, more purpose?" "Yes." "You understand my real identity?" "I do. And I want to meet your father. I want to understand the world you walked away from. Maybe together we can help the people he hurt. Maybe my money can finally be used for something real, for restoration instead of extraction." Amara cried. Not because she'd won, but because he was finally free. "I also need your help with something else," Marcus continued. "I need you to help me understand how to live differently. I've spent 30 years learning to want things I don't actually want. I need someone to teach me what actually matters." "I can do that," Amara said. "But you have to be willing to be wrong. You have to be willing to be humbled." "I am," Marcus said. "I already have been." Chapter 9. The Quiet Redemption. 6 months later, Marcus and Amara stood in a village in Zambia, on the grounds of a newly built school. The structure was simple: stone walls, large windows positioned to catch natural light, a library with 4,000 books gathered from donations across Africa and the diaspora. There was a medical clinic attached, staffed by volunteer doctors. There was a community hall where farmers could gather to learn about sustainable agriculture. It was beautiful in its functionality, beautiful in its service. Chief Kwame Okonkwo stood beside them, observing the work with an expression that suggested profound reckoning. The shock of his daughter's resurrection had evolved into something deeper, a mirror being held to his life, and it was reflecting imperfections he'd spent decades not looking at. At 68, he was beginning a process of redemption that would take the rest of his life. "Your mother wants to come next month," he said to Amara. "She wants to help." "Will she?" Amara asked gently. "Yes, I think she's been waiting permission for a long time." Marcus stood slightly apart, watching this exchange, the weight of family healing being carried by all three of them. The foundation he and Amara had started was now operational in 7 African countries. It had provided educational access to 12,000 children. It had restored farming land to displaced communities. It wasn't redemption, too much damage was permanent, but it was restitution. It was trying. He worked in the school twice a week now, teaching business basics to teenagers who'd never imagined such opportunities. He'd sold his jet. He'd downsized from 3 penthouses to 1 modest apartment. He'd redirected the money he wasn't spending on luxury toward impact. One afternoon, a young girl raised her hand during his class. She was perhaps 15, with fierce eyes and an intelligence that reminded him why he'd nearly destroyed the world, chasing money. "Mr. Chen," she asked, "why did you give up your big life to be here?" He thought of his empty apartment in New York, the meaningless deals, the silence that had been his constant companion. He thought of Amara reading to children by candlelight. He thought of belonging to something larger than profit. "Because I realized," he said carefully, choosing his words with precision, "that a big life isn't the same as a meaningful life. I had everything money could buy and felt nothing. I was empty. This woman, your teacher, she had nothing and felt everything. She taught me that real wealth is measured in moments, not money. In people, not power. In presence, not possessions. I came to this village thinking I could rescue her from poverty. Instead, she rescued me from meaninglessness. Subscribe for more stories of compassion, courage, and second chances. Thank you for watching. Black billionaire married a village girl, thinking she was poor, her true identity shocked. And remember, one act of kindness can rewrite a destiny. In the evening, Marcus and Amara walked through the village as rain began to fall. It was the rainy season, when the earth smelled like renewal and possibility. He took her hand, and she rested her head on his shoulder, the same gesture she'd once offered to a lonely man in an Italian suit who didn't know that he was drowning. They walked in silence, not needing words. The rain was loud enough. The earth was speaking in its own language. Somewhere in the village, a child was reading by candlelight, discovering that the world was larger than poverty. Somewhere, a farmer was learning sustainable methods to reclaim stolen land. Somewhere, healing was happening quietly, the way real healing always happens, not in moments of drama, but in the accumulation of small acts repeated with consistency and love. Marcus had come to save her. Instead, she'd saved him, and that, he finally understood, was the only real miracle. Not rescue, but transformation. Not ownership, but genuine connection. Not the appearance of redemption, but the slow, painful, beautiful work of actually becoming good. The rain fell heavier, and they didn't run. They simply walked together, two people who'd learned that the most valuable thing you can give another person is your true self. Flawed, learning, willing to change. And in that simple choice to be present, to be honest, to be human, everything that money had ever promised became irrelevant.